Walter Harris, a Vietnam veteran, sits unnoticed at a Navy SEAL ceremony, his faded Recon Team 3 patch mocked as fake. Displaced to a patio table, he watches young SEALs prepare their oath. Ryan Callahan, a recruit, recognizes Walter as the man who saved his uncle's life. Defying protocol, Ryan salutes him, sparking a chain of respect. The SEALs invite Walter to administer their oath, unveiling his heroic past. A viral video captures this moment. But what secrets from Walter's classified missions remain untold? Will his legacy reshape a town's view of its forgotten heroes? Share their sacrifices, courage, and legacy. Join our community to uncover powerful tales that remind us to see the invisible. Your support keeps these stories alive, because some salutes come from the heart, not orders. Walter J. Harris sat hunched in the back row of the bustling restaurant, his gnarled fingers trembling slightly as they curled around the chipped handle of a coffee mug long gone cold. The faint clink of his spoon against the ceramic was a quiet rebellion against the clamor of the crowded room. Young voices, sharp laughter, and the clatter of dishes weaving a tapestry of life he no longer felt part of. On his sleeve, a faded olive green patch clung stubbornly to his worn jacket, its black stitching frayed and barely legible. Recon Team 3, 1969. It was a relic of a life most couldn't fathom, a silent testament to the jungles of Vietnam, to nights spent crawling through mud, to the weight of lives saved and lost. The patch was more than fabric. It was a tether to the man he'd been, the man he sometimes feared he'd buried beneath decades of silence. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with the energy of youth and celebration. The Navy SEAL graduation ceremony, displaced to this local spot due to a scheduling snag, filled the air with anticipation. Young men in crisp dress uniforms moved with the confidence of those who hadn't yet seen the true cost of their oaths. Walter's eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, lingered on them. He didn't belong here, not really. He was just an old man with a wooden cane, his movements slow and deliberate, his presence barely registering in the swirl of activity. Yet he came every year, drawn not by invitation or recognition, but by a need he couldn't name. A need to see the fire in these young warriors' eyes, to know that the sacrifices of his past still echoed in their futures. The patch on his sleeve caught the eye of a group of young men waiting for a table. One, a broad-shouldered recruit with a fresh buzz cut, nudged his friend and smirked. "Check out the old-timer," he muttered, his voice low but not low enough. "Bet he snagged that patch off eBay." His companion, a wiry kid with a quick grin, chuckled. "Yeah, my grandpa says half the guys at the VFW are faking it, wearing medals they never earned." The words stung, though Walter's face betrayed nothing. 50 years of civilian life had taught him to absorb such skepticism like a blow he learned to brace for. To these boys, Vietnam was a history lesson, a grainy documentary. They couldn't know what it meant to carry the weight of 27 rescue missions, to navigate jungles where every shadow could be death, to lose a leg to a fall in Laos and something far heavier in the silence that followed. He didn't blame them. How could they understand a war that had aged into wheelchairs and canes, its heroes fading into the background of diners and coffee shops? Walter's grip tightened on his mug, the cold coffee inside rippling slightly. He remembered the faces of men he'd pulled from the jaws of chaos, brothers he'd brought home alive, and others whose names were etched only in his memory, their fates sealed in classified operations that would never see the light of history books. The patch was his proof, not to them, but to himself. It was the only piece of those years he could still touch, the only evidence that the best and worst moments of his life hadn't been a dream. He'd never considered replacing it, though the stitching unraveled a little more each year. To remove it would be to erase the man who'd worn it through fire and blood, who'd carried his team through the impossible and paid for it with pieces of his body and soul. The restaurant manager, a woman in her 30s with a harried expression and a clipboard clutched like a shield, approached his table. Her eyes flicked over him, his faded jacket, his cane propped against the chair, the single cup of coffee he'd been nursing for 2 hours. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped with forced politeness, "I'm sorry, but we need this table for a larger party. Would you mind moving to the patio? It's a nice day out there." Walter's gaze swept the room. Empty tables dotted the space, other solo diners undisturbed, their plates piled with food or drinks, refilled without question. He understood the subtext. An old man taking up space during their busiest event, contributing little more than a $2 coffee, was an inconvenience. His presence didn't fit the polished image of the day. Of course, Walter murmured, his voice soft but steady. He gathered his mug, his fingers brushing the worn patch as he reached for his cane. The movement was slow, deliberate, his prosthetic leg making each step a careful negotiation. No one offered to help. No one met his eyes as he shuffled toward the door, the weight of their indifference heavier than the ache in his bones. Outside, he chose a small table on the patio, tucked near the window where he could still see the ceremony preparations. The glass separated him from the world inside. Young SEALs adjusting their uniforms, their faces alight with pride and purpose. He envied them, not for their youth, but for the clarity they still had, the belief that their sacrifices would be seen, valued, remembered. Walter sipped his cold coffee, its bitterness a familiar comfort. Through the window, he watched the 16 recruits prepare to take their oath, their movements precise, their futures unwritten. They would face wars he couldn't imagine. Drones, cyber threats, enemies who fought not in jungles but in shadows of a different kind. Yet the core of their mission remained unchanged, to bring brothers home alive. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the faces of men he'd lost flooded back, soldiers whose families still waited for answers that would never come, their stories locked in the silence of classified files. He wore the patch for them too, a quiet vow to carry their memory when no one else would. As he sat, unnoticed and alone, the door swung open. A young SEAL recruit stepped out, his eyes catching on the faded patch. He froze, his posture stiffening as if he'd seen a ghost. Turning to his teammate, he whispered, "That man saved my uncle's life." The words were soft, but they carried a weight that shifted the air. Walter didn't hear them, but something changed in that moment, a ripple that would soon alter everything. For the first time in years, someone had seen not just the patch, but the man behind it, and the story of Recon Team 3, 1969, was about to find its way back into the light. The patch on Walter's sleeve wasn't there to boast of his own deeds, but to cradle the memory of those who had given so much. It was a quiet emblem, weathered by time, stitched not for glory, but for the solemn act of remembering. Inside the restaurant, a ceremony was stirring to life, the air thick with anticipation. Walter, seated alone at a patio table by the window, gazed through the glass, his eyes tracing the movements of the young Navy SEAL recruits inside. Their dress uniforms were pristine, their postures rigid with discipline, their faces etched with the weight of the oath they were about to swear. Among them stood Petty Officer Ryan Callahan, a 24-year-old from a small Ohio town, his heart pounding in the second row of the formation. Outside, Walter's solitude was a world apart, yet his presence would soon ripple through the ceremony in ways neither he nor Ryan could have foreseen. Ryan's mind wasn't entirely on the ceremony. His thoughts drifted to his uncle Tommy, whose stories of Vietnam had shaped his childhood. Tommy, a man of few words, had carried the war's scars, both visible and hidden, long after he returned home. His shoulder, riddled with shrapnel, never worked quite right, and his silences spoke louder than his rare tales. But every Veterans Day, Tommy's voice would soften, and he'd share one story that never changed. It was about a team leader named Walter Harris, a man who, under a hail of enemy fire, had crawled into a collapsed bunker to drag out 2 wounded Marines, Tommy among them. "Harris didn't even know my name," Tommy would murmur, his eyes distant. "Just saw a soldier in trouble and went in. Saved my life." Ryan had grown up with that story, the grainy black and white photograph of the rescue team seared into his memory. In it, Walter stood at the center, impossibly young, his face lined with exhaustion, yet resolute. That image sat on Tommy's dresser, a quiet shrine to a debt that could never be repaid. As Ryan stood at attention, the ceremony's preparations unfolding around him, a flicker of movement outside caught his eye. Through the window, he saw an elderly man sitting alone, his faded military jacket catching the light. Ryan's gaze sharpened, locking onto the patch on the man's sleeve. Recon Team 3, 1969. His breath caught. It was the same unit Tommy had spoken of countless times, the same patch from the photograph. But it wasn't just the patch. It was the man's profile, the way his head tilted slightly, that struck Ryan like a bolt. It was as if the face from that old picture had aged, weathered by decades, yet unmistakable. His heart thudded, a mix of disbelief and urgency swelling in his chest. Could it really be him? Without a second thought, Ryan broke formation, his polished shoes scuffing the floor as he moved toward the door. His drill instructor's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Callahan, get back in line!" But Ryan barely heard it. His mind was racing, consumed by the possibility that the man outside was Walter Harris, the man who had given him an uncle, a family, a childhood filled with Tommy's gruff laughter and quiet strength. He turned to his commanding officer, Master Chief Peterson, his voice steady but laced with desperation. "Sir, I need to step outside for just one moment." Peterson's frown deepened, his eyes narrowing at the breach of protocol. This was unheard of, a reckless act that could end Ryan's training, yet something in Ryan's tone, raw, earnest, almost pleading, made Peterson hesitate. "This better be important, Callahan," he said, his voice gruff but not entirely dismissive. Ryan nodded. "Yes, sir, it is." Pushing through the restaurant door, Ryan strode toward Walter's salon, his heart hammering. Walter looked up, startled. His coffee cup paused midair as he took in the sight of a young SEAL in full-dress uniform approaching him. "Sir," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the emotion clawing at his throat. "That patch on your sleeve. Recon Team 3? Did you serve with a Marine named Tommy Callahan?" Walter's eyes widened, a faint tremor passing through his hands as he set the cup down. The name hit him like a distant echo, pulling him back to a jungle choked with smoke and screams. "Tommy Callahan from Ohio," Walter said slowly, his voice rough with memory. "Kid who took shrapnel in his shoulder during the bunker collapse." Ryan nodded, his eyes glistening. "That's my uncle, sir. He's told me about you my whole life. You saved his life." For a moment, the world seemed to still. Walter's fingers brushed the patch on his sleeve, not to draw attention to it, but as if it held the weight of that day. The case, the fear, the instinct to act when everything else screamed to run. His chest tightened, not with pride, but with something heavier, something sacred. Ryan stood before him, a young man whose life had been shaped by a moment Walter had carried quietly for decades. "Your uncle," Walter said, his voice barely a whisper. "How is he?" Ryan replied, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "He's good, sir. Married, got 3 kids, runs a hardware store back home. He talks about you every Veterans Day, says he owes you everything." Walter shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips, though his eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "He doesn't owe me a thing," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I just did what needed doing." But to Ryan, those words carried the weight of a legacy, a debt of gratitude that had shaped his family, his purpose, his very reason for standing there in that uniform. The patch, the ceremony, the years between them, all of it converged in that moment, a quiet exchange that honored not just sacrifice, but the enduring ripple of a single act of courage. Under the dim glow of the restaurant's patio lights, a quiet tension hung in the air, thick with unspoken respect and the weight of history. Ryan, a young SEAL recruit, stood ramrod straight, his hand raised in a crisp salute. His eyes locked onto the elderly man before him, whose weathered face told stories no textbook could capture. The old man's hand trembled as he returned the salute, not from the frailty of age, but from a surge of emotion that seemed to ripple through his entire being. Walter Harris, a name that carried the weight of legend, stood there in his faded military jacket, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and disbelief. He hadn't expected this moment, hadn't sought it out. All he'd wanted was a quiet spot to watch the ceremony from afar, to feel a fleeting connection to a life he'd left behind decades ago. Yet here he was, the center of a scene that would etch itself into the hearts of everyone present. Inside the restaurant, the other SEAL recruits had begun to notice Ryan's absence from their formation. Whispers passed between them, a mix of curiosity and concern. Was he in trouble? Had he stepped out of line? Master Chief Peterson, a man whose stern demeanor could silence a room, sensed the shift in attention and strode outside to investigate. His boots clicked against the pavement. His mind braced for a disciplinary issue. But what he found stopped him cold. There was Ryan, his most promising recruit, standing at attention, saluting an elderly man whose posture, despite the cane and the years, still carried the unmistakable bearing of a warrior. Peterson's sharp eyes caught the patch on Walter's jacket, the insignia of a Vietnam-era Recon Team 3 veteran. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that name, Walter Harris. It wasn't just a name, it was a legacy, whispered in the hallowed halls of special operations briefings. A man whose courage under fire had shaped the very tactics these young recruits were learning. Peterson approached, his steps softer now, as if he were walking on sacred ground. "What's your name, sir?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with reverence. When Walter replied, "Walter Harris, Master Chief, Recon Team 3, Vietnam," Peterson's expression shifted. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a deep, unspoken admiration. He stood a little taller, his own salute a mirror of Ryan's. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a collision of eras, a bridge between the past and the present. "Sir," Peterson said, his voice firm yet warm, "it would be an honor if you'd join us inside for the ceremony." Walter blinked, caught off guard. His weathered hands gripped the cane a little tighter, and for a moment, doubt clouded his eyes. "I don't want to intrude," he said softly, his voice carrying the humility of a man who'd seen too much to seek the spotlight. "I was just watching from out here." But Ryan, still standing at attention, wasn't having it. "Sir," he said, his tone resolute but respectful, "you're not intruding. You helped build what we're about to become part of." The words landed like a vow, and Walter's breath caught. He felt the weight of those words, the acknowledgement of a sacrifice he'd buried deep, in a place where memories of jungles and gunfire still lingered. By now, the other recruits had begun to spill out onto the patio, drawn by the sight of their teammate and their master chief standing with this unassuming old man. They saw the patch on his jacket, the way Ryan and Peterson stood in quiet reverence, and understanding dawned. One by one, without a word, the 16 recruits formed a line, their bodies snapping to attention in perfect unison. It was a silent tribute, born not from orders, but from something deeper, a recognition of shared purpose, of a lineage that stretched across decades. Each young man stood tall, their eyes fixed on Walter, their hearts pounding with the realization that they were in the presence of a living legend. Peterson's gaze swept over his recruits, then settled on Walter. He made a decision, one that broke protocol, but honored something far greater. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment, "would you do us the honor of administering our oath?" The words hung in the air, and Walter's hands shook as he reached for his cane to steady himself. His eyes widened, a mix of shock and humility. "Master Chief," he stammered, I don't know if I'm qualified." But Ryan stepped forward, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Sir, you're the most qualified person here. Some salutes don't need orders." The words hit Walter like a wave, stirring memories of missions long past, of brothers lost, of a life spent in service. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. His body might have been frail, but his spirit burned bright, and the 16 recruits saw it in his eyes. The fire of a man who'd faced hell and come out stronger. "I'm not sure I remember the exact words," Walter admitted, his voice trembling with the weight of the moment. Peterson stepped closer, his smile gentle but firm. "Sir, with respect, you lived those words for over a year in enemy territory. I think you know them better than any of us." The words were a lifeline, pulling Walter back to a time when he'd led men through the darkest of nights, when every decision carried the weight of life and death. He nodded, his jaw tightening as he steadied himself. The restaurant manager, who had earlier asked Walter to move outside to avoid disrupting the event, appeared at the edge of the patio, her face pale as she took in the scene. The elderly man she'd dismissed as just another customer was now at the center of a formation of Navy SEALs, their eyes locked on him with unwavering respect. "Is everything all right out here?" she asked, her voice tinged with nervous uncertainty. Peterson turned to her, his tone calm but pointed. "Ma'am, this gentleman is Walter Harris, a Vietnam veteran who pioneered many of the reconnaissance techniques we still use today. We've asked him to administer our oath." The manager's eyes widened and shame washed over her as she realized her mistake. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Walter waved off her apology with a gentle smile, his humility unshaken. "No harm done, ma'am," he said, but Ryan wasn't ready to let it go. He stepped forward, his voice respectful but firm. "Actually, sir, there was harm done. You deserve better treatment than that." His words carried the weight of a young man who'd been trained to stand up for what was right, and Walter felt a swell of gratitude mixed with pride. He hadn't expected this, not the respect, not the recognition, not the chance to stand before these young warriors and lead them in their oath. By now, the scene had drawn the attention of other restaurant patrons. A few pressed against the windows, their phones raised to capture the moment unfolding outside. It was a sight that demanded attention. 16 elite recruits, their master chief, and an elderly veteran standing together in a moment of profound unity. Walter looked at the young faces before him. 16 men who'd endured months of grueling training, who'd pushed their bodies and minds to the breaking point, who were about to pledge their lives to a cause greater than themselves. He saw in them the same fire that had burned in his own heart decades ago, the same unyielding commitment to duty. "Gentlemen," Walter began, his voice growing stronger with each word, "raise your right hands and repeat after me." As he spoke, his trembling hands steadied, and his voice carried the weight of a lifetime of service. The ceremony that followed was unlike any other, a moment where past and present converged, where a forgotten hero was given the chance to pass the torch to a new generation. The recruits' voices echoed in unison, their words a solemn vow, but their eyes never left Walter. For them, he was more than a man. He was a symbol of everything they aspired to be: courageous, selfless, unbreakable. On a warm evening, the patio of a modest restaurant became the stage for an extraordinary moment in Navy SEAL history, far removed from the polished auditoriums or sterile conference rooms where such ceremonies typically unfolded. Under the soft glow of string lights, 16 young warriors stood tall, their faces a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. They were about to take an oath that would bind them to a legacy of sacrifice and honor, administered not by a high-ranking officer in crisp dress whites, but by Walter Harris, a weathered veteran whose own story had been buried under decades of classified missions and unspoken valor. Walter stood before them, his hands steady despite the weight of his 73 years. His voice, roughened by time but unwavering, carried the oath with a clarity that surprised even him. "I, Ryan Callahan," he began, pausing as the young man echoed his name with a voice thick with emotion. "I, Marcus Rodriguez," followed another, his eyes fixed on Walter as if anchoring himself to the moment. "I, David Kim," said the next, his tone resolute, yet trembling with the gravity of the words. The 16 voices blended into a solemn chorus, swearing to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Each syllable seemed to resonate with the weight of history, binding these men not just to their nation, but to the countless others who had spoken these words before them. As Walter recited the oath, his mind drifted back to a moment 53 years earlier when he had stood in their place. He could still feel the crisp air of that long-ago morning, the tightness in his chest as he swore the same vow, the faces of his brothers in arms vivid in his memory. Some of those faces belonged to men who never returned home, friends whose laughter and courage had been silenced in the jungles of Vietnam. The weight of that responsibility, the unspoken promise to carry their memory forward, pressed against Walter's heart now as it had then. He blinked back the sting of tears, focusing on the young men before him, their eyes bright with purpose, unaware of the full cost of the path they were choosing. When the oath concluded, "So help me God," the 16 SEALs remained at attention, their postures rigid with respect. Master Chief Peterson, a towering figure with a presence that commanded silence, gave a subtle nod to Ryan Callahan. The young SEAL stepped forward, his expression a mixture of determination and reverence. "Mr. Harris," Ryan said, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "there's something else we'd like to do, if you'll permit us." From his uniform pocket, Ryan produced a small object wrapped in soft cloth. His fingers moved carefully, almost reverently, as he unfolded it to reveal a SEAL trident pin, its polished surface catching the dim light. The trident was more than a badge. It was a symbol of brotherhood, of unrelenting commitment, of belonging to one of the most elite military units in the world. Ryan's gaze met Walter's, and in that moment, the older man sensed something profound was about to unfold. "Sir," Ryan continued, "my uncle told me about you. He said your missions in Vietnam were classified, your record sealed. He said the heroes like you went unrecognized, but we know what you did." Walter's breath caught in his throat. His eyes, already glistening, brimmed with tears as the weight of Ryan's words settled over him. For decades, his service had been a silent burden, his sacrifices locked away in the shadows of secrecy. He had carried the memories of those covert operations, the fear, the loss, the fleeting moments of triumph, alone with no medals to show for it, no public acknowledgement of the lives he had saved or the risks he had taken. And yet, here stood these young men, their faces filled with gratitude and respect, ready to honor him in a way he had never imagined. Master Chief Peterson stepped forward, taking the trident from Ryan's outstretched hand. "We can't give you the medals the bureaucrats decided you didn't earn," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of truth. "But we can give you this." With deliberate care, Peterson pinned the trident to Walter's worn jacket, just above the faded patch of Recon Team 3, a relic of his own service. The act was simple, yet it carried the weight of decades of unspoken recognition. The patio fell silent, the chatter from inside the restaurant fading into the background, as if the world itself paused to witness the moment. The 16 SEALs, without a word or signal, raised their hands in a unified salute. Walter, his vision blurred with tears, returned the gesture. His hand trembled, not from age or frailty, but from the overwhelming surge of emotions he had suppressed for half a century. Pride, grief, gratitude, and a quiet sense of vindication swirled within him, each feeling vying for dominance. He thought of the men he had lost, the missions that had cost him pieces of his soul, and the years he had spent believing his sacrifices had been forgotten. Now, standing before these young warriors, he felt seen, his legacy no longer confined to the shadows. At a nearby table, a young woman had been quietly recording the ceremony on her phone, her eyes wide with awe. Within minutes, she would upload the video to social media, her caption reading, "Old veteran gets the recognition he deserved 50 years too late." The post would spread quickly, touching hearts across the internet, but it could never capture the full depth of the moment. It couldn't convey the way Ryan stepped closer to Walter, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for the older man's ears. "Uncle Tommy sends his love," he said softly, "and he says, thank you for giving him a life worth living." The words struck Walter like a wave, drawing him back to memories of Tommy, a young soldier he had carried through hell and brought back to safety. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak, his heart swelling with a gratitude he couldn't articulate. The restaurant manager, a middle-aged man with a hesitant smile, approached the group. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice tinged with newfound respect, "we'd be honored if you'd join us inside. Your meal is on the house, and I'd like to move your table to the front of the restaurant, if that's okay with you." Walter glanced at the young woman who had seated him outside earlier, perhaps unknowingly relegating him to the margins like a relic of a forgotten era. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment now, but Walter's smile was kind. "That's very generous," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions still lingering in his chest. "But it's not necessary." Master Chief Peterson interjected, his tone firm but warm. "Actually, sir, it is necessary. These men need to see what they are working toward. They need to understand that the oath they just took connects them to something bigger than themselves, a legacy that you helped build." His words were not just for Walter, but for the young SEALs, a reminder of the unbroken thread that tied them to the past. As the group moved inside, Walter found himself enveloped by the 16 new SEALs. They surrounded him, each eager to shake his hand, to hear a fragment of his story, to touch the history they had just become a part of. Ryan lingered close, his eyes reflecting a personal connection to Walter's past. Marcus, with a quiet intensity, asked about the challenges of Vietnam, his questions revealing a hunger to understand the sacrifices that had paved the way for his own service. David, the youngest, listened with wide-eyed reverence, as if Walter's presence made the weight of his new title feel more real. The other restaurant guests watched in quiet amazement, their conversations hushed as they observed the elderly man who had been nearly invisible to them moments before. The reverence shown by these elite warriors transformed Walter in their eyes, from an unremarkable figure to a living testament of courage and sacrifice. For Walter, the moment was both humbling and surreal. He had spent decades carrying his service in silence, believing his story would remain untold. Now, surrounded by these young men who saw him not as a relic, but as a cornerstone of their legacy, he felt the pieces of his past finally falling into place. The trident pinned to his jacket gleamed faintly, a symbol not just of recognition, but of a brotherhood that transcended time. In a modest coastal diner, the air buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation and the clink of silverware, but a young boy's curiosity cut through the noise. Tugging at his father's sleeve, his wide eyes fixed on a group of soldiers gathered around an elderly man, he whispered, "Daddy, why are all those soldiers being so kind to that old guy?" His father, who had stood by the window, silently observing the heartfelt scene unfold, crouched down to meet his son's gaze. His voice was soft but heavy with meaning. "Son, sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who go unnoticed. And sometimes it takes one hero to see another." The boy's brow furrowed, his young mind grappling with the weight of those words, sensing something profound but not yet able to name it. Outside the sunlight, it caught the glint of a steel trident pinned to Walter Harris's weathered jacket, a symbol that had found its rightful place after decades of absence. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a testament to a life of unspoken valor, earned not through parades or speeches, but through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. For 50 years, Walter had carried the weight of his service in silence, his deeds buried deep within his heart, never demanding recognition or reward. As the soldiers saluted him, their crisp gestures spoke louder than any words could, and Walter felt a knot loosen in his chest. For the first time in half a century, he stood not as a forgotten veteran, but as a man whose sacrifices had finally been seen. The oath he'd taken so long ago, the one that had shaped his life, felt whole again. The circle of his service had closed, and in that moment, Walter Harris felt like he had come home. By dusk, a video of the impromptu ceremony had ignited the internet. A young woman, her phone trembling in her hands as she recorded, had captured something raw and powerful. An elderly man in a worn jacket, surrounded by warriors who knew the true cost of sacrifice. The clip spread like wildfire, racking up 500,000 views before the night was over. Comments flooded in, each one a thread in a tapestry of collective awe and gratitude. Veterans shared stories of their own unspoken battles. A woman wrote, "My grandfather was in Vietnam and never spoke of it. This brought tears to my eyes." A young soldier added, "These SEALs just showed the world what respect really means." The virtual world buzzed with admiration, but the real impact rippled through Walter's small coastal town. Neighbors who had passed him on the street for years, offering little more than a polite nod, now saw him differently. They realized they had been walking by a living legend, a piece of history who had lived among them in quiet humility. A week later, the mayor stood before the town hall, signing a proclamation to declare Walter Harris Day. The gesture was simple but profound, a public acknowledgement of a man who had never sought the spotlight. Walter, true to his nature, declined any grand celebration, his weathered face breaking into a shy smile as he waved off the fuss. But the honor mattered more than he could say. At the diner where the ceremony had taken place, a small brass plaque now adorned a permanently reserved table. Reserved for Walter Harris, finally seen. That table became more than a piece of furniture. It transformed into a shrine for the living, a place where people left tokens of their own connections to service. Military medals, faded photographs, and dog tags from loved ones who had served began to accumulate, each item a quiet story of sacrifice. The table stood as a reminder that heroes weren't just names in history books. They were the people who lived next door, who walked with canes and carried memories too heavy to share. Inspired by Walter's story, local high school students launched a project to interview elderly veterans in the community. What began as a modest assignment grew into a movement, as they uncovered dozens of untold stories, lives of courage and sacrifice that had faded into the background of everyday life. These were men and women who had returned from wars to work ordinary jobs, raise families, and blend into the fabric of the town. their heroism tucked away like old letters in a drawer. The students listened, wide-eyed, as veterans shared memories of fear, loss, and quiet triumphs, their voices trembling with emotions long buried. Through these conversations, the town began to see itself anew, recognizing the heroes who had been there all along. Walter, now a reluctant figure of recognition, found his daily walks through town changed. People greeted him with warm smiles and quiet nods of respect, not as a celebrity but as a man whose story had opened their eyes. They saw in him a reminder to look closer at the people around them, to wonder about the stories hidden behind weathered faces. A young boy named Marcus, whose father was deployed overseas, began visiting Walter's modest home. Their meetings weren't formal, just quiet moments on the porch, the creak of the swing mingling with the sound of gulls in the distance. Marcus, his small frame perched on the edge of the seat, would ask questions that carried the weight of his own fears. One afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Mr. Harris, were you scared when you saved those soldiers?" Walter's eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, met the boy's. He paused, the weight of 50 years in his silence. "Every single day, son," he said finally, his voice steady but soft. "But fear doesn't stop you from doing what's right. It just makes you human." Marcus nodded, clutching those words like a lifeline, a piece of wisdom to carry until his father came home. At the diner, the manager, Jennifer, had become one of Walter's fiercest advocates. Raised in a military family, she had grown up hearing stories of service. But somewhere along the way, the meaning had slipped through her fingers. That day, when she had nearly asked Walter to move outside to make room for a larger group, haunted her. The memory of 16 SEALs saluting him, their faces etched with reverence, had shaken her awake. "I keep thinking about what could have happened," she confessed to Walter during one of his weekly visits, her voice thick with emotion. "What if Ryan hadn't recognized you? What if you just sat outside and we never knew who you were?" Walter's smile was gentle, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Then it would have been just another day, Jennifer." But it wasn't, and that's what counts. His words, simple yet profound, eased the guilt she carried. Inspired by that moment, Jennifer started a tradition at the diner. Whenever veterans or active duty military came in, she would point to Walter's table and share his story, not to put him on a pedestal, but to remind people that heroism often hid in plain sight, cloaked in humility and quiet resilience. 3 months later, Ryan Callahan, the SEAL who had first recognized Walter, returned to town on leave from his first assignment. He knocked on Walter's door, his uniform crisp but his expression soft with gratitude. The visit was brief, but it carried the weight of shared understanding, a bond forged not just by service, but by the recognition of what it meant to carry that service quietly. As Ryan stood on the porch, the two men exchanged few words, but their silence spoke volumes. For Walter, the visit was a reminder that his story, once buried in the shadows, had sparked something larger, a ripple of respect and remembrance that would outlive him. Ryan carried a letter from his Uncle Tommy, a man too overwhelmed by his own heart to make the journey himself. The words on the page were plain but heavy, etched with the weight of decades. Tommy had wrestled for 50 years to find a way to express his gratitude to Walter, a man whose quiet heroism had shaped lives in ways words struggled to capture. As Ryan read the letter silently, his chest tightened, imagining his uncle's trembling hands penning each line, his eyes likely brimming with tears he'd never let fall. The letter spoke of a moment that had haunted Tommy, not out of pain but out of awe, the memory of watching Ryan, his nephew, reach out and shake Walter's hand. That simple gesture had been the closest Tommy ever came to articulating the depth of his admiration, a bridge between 2 generations of sacrifice. When Ryan prepared to leave, Walter, his weathered face softened by a rare smile, pressed something delicate into his hands, something wrapped carefully in tissue paper, as if it held a piece of his soul. Ryan unfolded it with reverence, revealing the original Recon Team 3 patch from Walter's uniform, its edges frayed from missions cloaked in secrecy, missions that had carved lines of quiet burden into Walter's eyes. "For your uncle," Walter said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of years unspoken. "Tell him some things are worth holding on to." Ryan felt the patch's texture under his fingertips, imagining the jungles, the gunfire, the silent nights Walter had endured while wearing it. He nodded, unable to speak, his throat thick with the realization that this was more than fabric. It was a testament to a life of service, a life that had gone unseen for too long. That evening, Walter sat on his porch, the seal trident pinned to his chest, glinting faintly in the fading light. The sunset painted the sky in hues of amber and crimson, casting a warm glow over the small town that had finally begun to notice him. For years, Walter had moved through its streets like a ghost, his sacrifices buried under the weight of classified files in a nation that didn't know how to look for its heroes. But now, as he sat there, his heart felt lighter than it had in decades. The townsfolk's glances weren't just polite nods anymore. They carried respect, curiosity, even gratitude. For the first time in 50 years, Walter wasn't invisible. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the moment seep into his bones, knowing that some salutes are born not from orders, but from the quiet recognition of a heart that understands. Walter chose not to return to the ceremony the following year. 3 months after that day at the restaurant, he slipped away peacefully in his sleep, his body finally at rest, but his legacy only beginning to unfold. At precisely 9:47 a.m., the exact moment Ryan had first laid eyes on him, Ryan returned to the restaurant. His dress uniform was pristine, every crease sharp, every metal gleaming, but his hands trembled slightly as he sat in Walter's chair. He ordered a black coffee, just as Walter had, and let it sit untouched, the steam rising like a silent prayer. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, a mix of pride and sorrow. Standing, he faced the empty chair, his eyes tracing its worn edges as if Walter's presence still lingered there. He saluted, crisp and deliberate, and whispered, "I still remember." The words were soft, but they carried the strength of a vow, a promise to carry Walter's story forward. That afternoon, a plaque was unveiled, its words etched in honor of those who had been forgotten but would never be again. It wasn't just a marker, it was a declaration, a chain broken, a legacy reclaimed. Year after year, on the anniversary of Walter's recognition, Navy SEALs would come to the restaurant. They didn't come for fanfare, or cameras. They came to sit in that chair, to feel the weight of Walter's sacrifice, to honor a man who had carried the burden of silence so they could carry the torch of remembrance. Each SEAL who sat there felt a quiet connection, their hearts stirring with the same resolve that had driven Walter through the shadows of his service. Marcus, the boy who had once sat wide-eyed on Walter's porch, listening to stories that felt like legends, grew into a man shaped by those moments. When he enlisted in the Marines, he carried Walter's spirit with him, a fire kindled by the old man's quiet strength. Before shipping out to boot camp, Marcus made one final stop at the restaurant. He sat in Walter's chair, the wood creaking under him, and pulled out a letter Walter had written to him years before. His voice steadied as he read aloud, "Son, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear. Carry that with you." The words hit him like a pulse, each syllable sinking deep into his core. Marcus folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his pocket, knowing it would be his anchor through the trials ahead. As he stood, he felt Walter's presence, not just in the chair, but in the resolve now burning in his own heart. Jennifer, the restaurant's heart and soul, kept the tradition alive even after she sold the business. She passed it on not as a transaction, but as a sacred trust. The new owners understood they weren't just inheriting a building or a menu. They were stewards of a legacy, guardians of a story that had woven itself into the fabric of the town. Walter's SEAL trident, the one he'd worn that day on the porch, found a home in the Navy SEAL Museum, accompanied by a simple inscription, "Earned through action, recognized through brotherhood." The words were modest, but they carried the weight of a life lived in service, a life that had finally been seen. Yet the true legacy wasn't in plaques or museum displays. It was in the quiet shifts that rippled outward. People began to look at elderly veterans differently, not as strangers, but as bearers of stories worth hearing. In coffee shops, doors were held open a little longer. In grocery stores, clerks lingered to listen to tales of service, their impatience replaced by curiosity. Communities began to understand that heroes don't always wear capes or carry banners. Sometimes they walk quietly among us, their sacrifices hidden in the lines of their faces. Walter Harris had spent 50 years invisible, his classified missions a silent burden, his sacrifices unrecognized. But in that one perfect moment, surrounded by warriors who knew the cost of service, he had been seen. And sometimes being seen just once is enough to change everything.